when I talk to athletes, sometimes they ask me to say, you know, what's better, like a supplement or a whole food? And my first question is always, how much money do you have in your pocket? You know, if you have $2, then go get a glass of milk, right? If you have $20, then maybe, you know, money isn't an issue. Then a supplement is useful or can be useful.
It really comes down to what works for you and how better you can adhere to it. And welcome to another episode with Astrid, your RD. And today I am sitting down with Stuart Phillips, who is going to chat with me about protein again. So we are talking about protein research, specifically on MPS and aging. So stay tuned because, you know, we all get old. We're gonna get old. So this is probably something that you should be watching. Make sure you share, put some likes, subscribe, and send to someone who might benefit from this. Hello.
Hi, Astrid. How are you?
I'm very, very happy to see you. Today, I think we are talking about protein again, but this time, for those who haven't watched our previous interview or previous conversation, it is on YouTube. It is amazing, everything we spoke about, all things protein.
Yeah.
But this time specifically, we're going to talk about the relationship between protein and its effect on muscle protein synthesis, as well as how important it is in aging. You recently published a paper on how important protein is in this particular case. There's a lot to go through, so we might better get into it.
Sure.
So the first part I wanted to explore with you was some basic terms that people are not very sure about. And this is pretty much all related to protein, but specifically on nitrogen balance.
Yep.
And there are two other terms that are fractional synthetic rate and fractional breakdown rate. So let's talk a little bit about these three particular concepts, and then we can move on to what the relationship between protein and muscle protein synthesis seems to be.
Sure, yeah. So nitrogen balance is really, when we talk about it, it's actually protein balance in the body. So as the name implies, you measure every source of nitrogen coming in, so from diet or anything from a liquid source as well. And then you measure everything going out as well. So about 80% of the nitrogen that we lose is in the form of urea. That's the breakdown product that we excrete in urine. But then there's fecal losses. There's also sweat losses, skin losses, that sort of thing. So they're laborious experiments to conduct. Not too many people do them these days. Usually people just do maybe a urine collection or something like that. But the thought is that it's the balance of protein that's going in and leaving your body. And so if it's in a positive sense, then it means you're gaining protein. And if it's negative, it obviously means you're losing protein. The difficult part is actually, it sounds really easy to do, but it's not. It's really difficult. And the method actually has a few flaws, not the least of which is you don't really know what's going on inside the person when you do these experiments. So, you know, it's sort of the balance in and balance out, but we don't know what's going on inside there. So that's where the MPS, or the fractional synthetic rate, or MPB, or the fractional breakdown rate of muscle, which would be your largest body store of protein, is important. Because, you know, in the analogy I like to say, it's like a brick wall. So there are bricks going in, those are amino acids, that's the synthesis. And then there are bricks coming out, and that's the breakdown. And, you know, people are sort of like, well, it sounds odd why do you have both going on? And it's as if there's a mechanism that's constantly making sure the wall is in good shape. And so it provides for upkeep and maintenance. And, you know, that's a good thing. So that would be an internal look into what's going on inside here. So combining those two, I think that would be a decent way of doing things. But I think you can get a lot more sophisticated than nitrogen balance for sure.
So when you talk about these particular terms, are we talking about protein turnover?
Yeah.
Is it the same?
Yeah.
When we relate to that topic specifically?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And turnover really does refer to, it's sort of the synthesis and the breakdown. And so it's that cycle that we talk about. And lots of times you'll see, you know, free amino acids and then protein, often muscle protein. And we talk about the turnover. And I think it's maybe lost on people. Like we're exceptionally good at, you know, even when we break down proteins, the amino acids that appear in that pool are, for the most part, are reutilized. We turn over probably about 4 to 5 times more protein in our bodies than we actually lose. So we're pretty good at hanging on to it.
Is there a particular place in our body that tends to occur these processes, this protein turnover, more than others, like specifically maybe certain organs or more muscle? Do you have any data or any perhaps insights on where might this happen more often than other places?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have a great friend, Luke Van Loon, and I get credit to him. And the bottom line is that he will sort of see, he'll put his arm out and he'll say, look at your arm, like in 3 or 4 months, the muscle in your arm, it'll be a new muscle. It will have completely turned over. So the amino acids that were there, at day 0 are not the same ones that were there, 3 or 4 months later. And so muscle, even though it's really big, actually turns over quite slowly. It's about 1.5% of its mass turns over in a day. Whereas if we look at our intestines, for example, and I would say, if you could do an X-ray and look here, 4 days later, it would be a new intestine. So they turn over, almost, I think, 40 to 50 times faster than muscle tissue. So certain tissues turn over very rapidly, but you've got a small protein mass in terms of your intestines. Other tissues turn over quite slowly, but you've got a huge muscle mass. Probably the tissue that's most active, and it's still very small, but is liver. So its proteins turn over extraordinarily rapidly, and it's not big, but it's a very dynamic tissue. So some, bone even turns over, bone protein, collagen protein as well. So there are different pools. They turn over at different rates, but the more what we call labile pools are actually in your gut. Okay,
and this protein turnover is happening 24/7?
Yeah.
Would you say that?
All the time, yeah. And relatively speaking, it's affected obviously when you feed and you eat amino acids, and then eat protein and amino acids come into your system. That spikes the synthesis side and puts a cap on the breakdown side. But then when you're sleeping, it's still going on. It tends to obviously get down regulated and emphasize the breakdown side of things. But so it's sort of this fluctuating process. But 24/7, it's always going on.
I had a question, like just looking at a hypothetical case that you only had 25 grams of protein that you could eat. Taking it before or after resistance training, if you only had that 25 grams of protein, you had no other form of eating protein earlier or later, that's the only thing you have.
Sure.
Is there any, when would be more optimal? Like if you take it before or after a training session, and what form of protein would be ideal, the most ideal? Would be whole foods? Would it be whey? Would it be hydrolyzed whey or essential amino acids, BCAAs? What would it be?
Yeah.
It's a tough question.
Yeah. It's got a lot of parts to it. So I think the window, of when you would take it is probably a little less critical than we might have thought, 5 or 10 years ago, definitely than 20 years ago. It was sort of, if you don't eat it right away afterwards, you're going to be in trouble. Probably that window is open for a lot longer than we think. And there's a group recently wrote a review calling it, instead of a window, it was a garage door. It was open for a long time and really wide, which I thought was a good idea. Probably after. Your muscle is very receptive to carbohydrates and to proteins, and putting them into protein to be stored and utilized. And so making new muscle, for example, is the time that I would advise ingesting the protein. It doesn't have to be immediately afterwards. I think that's a little bit ridiculous. But the source, it probably depends. If you only have 25 grams, then I'm going to say, you have to get some other nutrition as well. I go for whole food. So when I talk to athletes, sometimes they ask me to say, what's better, like a supplement or a whole food? And my first question is always, how much money do you have in your pocket? If you have $2, then go get a glass of milk, right? If you have $20, then maybe, money isn't an issue. Then a supplement is useful or can be useful. But, most foods have nutrients that we need as well. And so, try and get those into the system. And we talk about nutrient dense sources of protein. So dairy and meat and eggs and that sort of thing. Not that plant sources aren't, they can be too. But generally animal source proteins are particularly nutrient dense. So that would be my choice. But then if you're going to sort of, come down the hierarchy, it would be probably whey protein, then the essential amino acids. The only amino acid that really makes any sense if you're going to take it in isolation is leucine. So branched chains, people say, oh, they work. Well, they work because they've got leucine in them. So the other two branched chains are actually, they're immaterial in terms of the formulation. And the formulations always emphasize leucine anyway, because people know that it's important. So
I agree. Well, this was a little bit of a tough question. Now, when it comes to what's more important when it comes to total protein intake, whether we decide what is more important, is it total protein intake, or is it resistance training when it comes to hypertrophy and building muscle?
Yeah. Well, resistance training by a landslide. And I think that's sort of, a lot of people get a little bit twisted about that one. So I'll just sort of put it in perspective. We did a meta-analysis a number of years ago now. I don't think the results would have changed even if we update it now. And the young guy that did it was Rob Morton. He was a PhD student of mine, did an outstanding job. But one figure that I had him create, and it's actually, sadly, it's in the supplementary part of the paper, but was to show in real terms. And I don't think when people look at meta-analyses, they look at forest plots and there's all those little dots and you're trying to line them up and it says effect. And people are like, oh, well, it's pretty big, it's about 1 kilo. And not usually that scale is not in actual kilograms. When we actually put it in real terms, the biggest contribution by a long shot was resistance exercise. So you got about 80+% of the benefit in terms of either strength and particularly, gain in muscle from just doing the exercise and doing it consistently. And then protein adds, the icing on top, if you like, of the cake. So it's not a huge effect. And so when people talk about, oh, I'm not getting enough protein, it's limiting my gains. Actually, it's probably A, you're not getting enough energy. And B, I always, particularly with younger athletes, I say, tell me how many times you're getting to the gym and be honest. And they're like, well, I got there twice this week and once last week. I'm like, that's hurting you right there. I said, you need to get to the gym, and there's no substitute for actually going to the gym. So the protein can't turn you into something. It just adds a thin layer on top. Okay.
So it's kind of saying you cannot out protein for training.
Right. You have to
kind of
and out protein. So no amount of protein will make up for not going to the gym. Exactly.
Correct. Exactly. Awesome. All right. Well, now let's talk about a particular term, like just now moving to more like an aging. I'd like for you to explain a little bit more about why is that the older we get, the more protein we need. So is there an optimal protein intake, let's say gram per kilogram of body weight after, like in ranges, like after we turn 40, then 50, 60s and 60 plus? Yeah. Is there like a specific ranges the older we get that we should be aiming for more?
Yeah. So I wish I could give you a really neat answer. Yes, when you turn 40, you should be doing, when you turn 50, you should be doing this, but I can't. So what I'll say is this, is that, so age is, people say it's just, right? And the older I get, the more I say that. But it's true, like chronological age, oftentimes people say, oh, well, in your 50s. And I think that's a generic comment on the average 50-year-old and what a 50-year-old might be doing. But, we found individuals even into their 60s and 70s who metabolically look a lot like they might be in their 30s because they're so physically active. So I think aging drives some of the decline, but physical activity is a big contributor to that. So the more active you can be as you get older, the more those requirements probably don't go up as much, to be really honest. Okay. So, but let's just say, at some point aging is going to happen and you're going to go downhill. So to alleviate that, we think that protein intakes need to be at least 1.2 grams per kilo. So that's 50% higher than the current either RDI or RDA, whatever standard, which is about 0.8. And up to around sort of 1.6. And then we think that things begin to plateau off. In other words, you can eat more protein and you can certainly digest it, but whether you can use it, I think, is the key part. And we don't think that you can make great use of protein intakes that are above that level. as you get older, the reason for this, what you refer to, we call anabolic resistance, is we don't really know what it is. I suspect that a strong portion of it, a large portion of it, is due to inactivity. We can make younger people look older in terms of their muscle being anabolically resistant by putting a cast on their leg or making them immobile, or they've done studies where they put younger people on bed rest. And they begin to look, they have a phenotype and a look then that makes them seem as if they're older. Like metabolically, they get messed up, their muscles get insulin resistant, and the protein goes along with it. So, okay. I mean, I guess the message is definitely stay active as you get older and try and get a little bit of extra protein in your diet. I think that will be, and then, this is going to happen. It doesn't matter. We haven't found a way to turn the clock back yet. So, it's about doing this as opposed to doing that, right? So try to age well.
mitigate the muscle loss.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. It's about the steepness of the curve. And I do think that, one theory that we've put forward are there are moments in an older person's life that we call them disuse events, where they take a substantial decline. So if they're hospitalized, if they're sick, if they go through treatment for cancer, for example, they have these events where that's where they lose a tremendous amount of muscle. And the difference is young people, they go down and they come back up, and older people just simply don't. So they'll go down and then now they're on a different curve. So they're actually shifted in a downward direction and heading towards, it's not really a threshold, but a level of muscle and function and probably metabolic health that's going to put them at greater risk. So, try and avoid those, or if you have one, work hard to try and get back from it. But as you get older, the truth is it takes a lot longer to sort of recover, if that's the right word.
And I can tell you that from experience, because I am a clinical dietitian. I work in a rehab hospital, and 80% of the patients are elderly, and they have come from ICU hospitalizations or like any type of surgery that requires a little bit of time to do rehab. Yeah. So I get these patients that obviously they come and they look wasted. They look like they've lost a lot of muscle. But the other problem seems to be like at least for a good number of people, the more they age, the less their appetite. So they struggle with appetite. They don't like eating protein. It's like so difficult to make them eat that's another barrier that I think puts them in a higher risk even. And on top of it, like if they are recovering, but they are feeling tired, unwell, it is harder to make them exercise as well. So there are so much barriers along the way that seem to put the things a little bit more steeper when it comes to that recovery from that downhill that you talk about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's a struggle. It's definitely something that, and when you're dealing with the clinical populations that you deal with, Astrid, it doesn't surprise me at all to hear, yes, your appetite does go down. People who have been in hospital, I mean, A, hospital food is not always the greatest, and, B, their appetite is suppressed, and so people eat less, and then when they're recovering probably from whatever it is that they've been in hospital for, particularly if they've been in the ICU, then it's very difficult to get back, and there's lots of things that are going on, and if you're older and mobility and everything, so it becomes a battle. I think one of the things that's interesting is to begin to try and impress upon if they're an intensivist, an ICU clinician, the survivorship rates from treatment for, you name it, people that go into the ICU, and right now COVID is really knocking us backwards, they're incredible, frankly. Like, we're getting people to survive the ICU experience, survivorship for cancer, lots of things, is getting them to understand that because we're having all these survivors, we would like to have, and there's a great guy named Paul Wishmeyer at Duke he's an ICU physician, and he says we want thrivers, not survivors. And so there's a lot of living to be done if we can get you out of the ICU. And so he's fond of sort of saying is that muscle matters, and we need to think about what the folks on the other side of this are going to do. So it's a mindset as well. But I 100% agree with you. It's a really tough battle for sure.
In those extreme cases, when exercise is limited or probably not an option for at least for a period of time, is protein higher protein intake perhaps a good mitigating solution to prevent muscle protein breakdown in higher levels, I guess?
Yeah, it's still controversial. I've had the privilege of sitting around with a lot of ICU folks, and I'm sort of like one doesn't belong, but so I'm the exercise guy, and it's hard obviously to get any physical therapy in the ICU. It does happen, but not a lot. So anything would count, even sitting up at the bedside for patients who are recovering, or if they are able to become mobile, then get them up and get them walking around. That will make things better. But if you can't, then obviously the only degree of freedom you have left is to try and keep protein high. And, I think the best you could hope for is to slow the loss, to mitigate things rather than focusing on, anabolism or building up. That will really only happen in a situation where you make someone mobile. So it sort of comes back to the, what's more important? Well, it's always mobility and loading and physical activity ahead of the dietary mitigation. But, protein, maybe omega-3 fatty acids, lots of other sort of niche molecules might be able to help those individuals for sure.
The other question I wanted to add in there is potentially if we have an individual that obviously has lost or is at higher risk of losing muscle, what type of training or exercise would be ideal? So are we comparing, for example, resistance training with endurance training, like walking or jogging, which for the most part, that's what most people would do, is just walking or just gentle exercise, but not necessarily resistance training. So what would be most beneficial when it comes to putting those gains back in this population?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I have a colleague at McMaster named Marty Gabala, who's a big high intensity interval guy. And he and I actually did one of these online courses called a MOOC, a massive online open course. And the ongoing debate, although it's not really a debate, is, what's more important? So Marty's the HIIT and the fitness guy and, do the aerobic work. And I'm the, no, resistance training is better, and it's a bit of a comedy that we try and play throughout the whole thing. But the reality is that they're both important. But I mean, if we're going to talk about reclaiming lost muscle, there's really only one stimulus, and that's resistance exercise. So, if we can get patients to do that, and in the recovery phase, even better, and there's a body of literature now talking about prehabilitation. So if a surgery, for example, is elective, and that it's going to happen, whether that's a cancer surgery or an orthopedic surgery in particular, knee replacement, hip replacement, is to actually try and get yourself ready to go through the surgical experience, or get yourself ready to withstand the, whatever it is, your chemotherapy, your radiation, and that sort of thing. And it's about building up reserve. And that's really, people say, what does that mean? And I'm like, it's basically muscle, and it's about trying to get yourself, and so instead of going like this, we know there's going to be a downhill, you actually get yourself to an elevated state. So the downhill is, the valley's lower, and hopefully the recovery is better. My opinion is we could all stand to do a bit more resistance exercise. Very few people do. And the same would be true of patients. But, if you can't convince somebody to do it and they say, you know what, I'll walk. I'll take that, better than doing nothing, much better than doing nothing. And that's, that's a tough message, but I think that to your point around, it's sometimes hard to get these patients to do something. So you would be happy with, there's the checklist.
A little bit.
Will they be active? Yes. Okay. Will they have a little bit more protein? Yes. Okay. And what can we get them to do? So you got to be pragmatic about it too.
With that rehabilitation that you mentioned, is that a particular time frame or period where that you would think the research seems to support? Like, let's say, rehabilitation at least for 12 weeks or 8 weeks. How much time do you recommend in this case to kind of really build something good baseline before you kind of go downhill?
Yeah, a good question. I don't know that there's a consensus on that. Again, I sort of sit on the periphery of a lot of these questions, but I'm privileged to be able to work with people who are interested in them. I think what they realize is that the stress of surgery or a treatment or, something is actually not dissimilar from like running a marathon or, for example. So nobody says, okay, you're going to run a marathon tomorrow, go, or you're going to be in tough. It's rough, right? So I think that the key thing is, you know, the more you can train or get ready for that event, then, you know, the better off you are. But, you know, if you only have 2 weeks notice and they're like, your surgery's 2 weeks from now and that's all you have, then you know, they'll take anything that you can get. But I don't know that there's, I mean, you know, the exercise physiologist in me wants to say the longer the better. But the reality of, you know, scheduling elective surgeries is that you may only get a, you know, 2 or 3 weeks notice, depending on, you know, where in the world you are, whether it's a national subsidized healthcare system or, you know, pay for use or whatever it is. But so orthopedic patients in our city, for example, get anywhere from about 4 weeks notice would be the shortest to about 3 months. So if you've got 3 months to train, you know, that's a reasonable amount of time. And I think you can, you know, get yourself in pretty good shape for the surgery.
That's great. That's great. You spoke about anabolic resistance, and that term would be good to kind of go back and explain what it is and why it's like MPS in older adults require higher protein ingestion than the younger counterparts, for example.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the concept isn't too difficult to understand so if we took a young person and we gave them, you know, your 25 gram of protein example, we would get this muscle protein synthesis. If we gave the same dose to an older person that weighed, you know, the same amount and had this, you know, roughly speaking, you know, even a similar amount of muscle mass, you'd only get this amount of response. And so that's a chronological age-related phenomenon, but I think you can also, like if we did the same thing to a younger person, but we looked at their leg that had just been immobilized for 2 weeks, so we put a cast under or a knee brace, then they get the same response. So it's activity-related, but I think that there's something around aging in there that's going wrong as well. So literally speaking, it's just a resistance to the normal anabolic effect of protein, which is, you know, how much muscle protein synthesis gets stimulated by a given load of amino acids. So we can overcome that by feeding people more protein, or probably more specifically, we can overcome it by giving them more leucine. Leucine's the one amino acid that it's, you know, it's sort of, the analogy is, you know, when that brick shows up, it's like the whole machinery begins to put more bricks into the wall. Without that brick, it never really starts or gets started. So, yeah.
So in that case, if we went to the first example I gave you, that you only have 25 grams of protein, looking at the form of protein, like we know that some forms of like whole foods will have less potential leucine availability than, for example, whey protein that will have a decent amount of leucine. Would you change there, like you probably will benefit more from the whey protein than actual food, or perhaps specifically recommending this particular food will give you this amount of leucine that you need, equivalent to perhaps having just your whey protein?
Yeah, and again, I think it's sort of context dependent. You know, who are we feeding? What's the end goal, right? So the original answer was, you know, you need other nutrients anyway, so let's try and get those into the system. Now we talk about a patient who's not as keen on food, and it's like, well, can we get them to ingest 25 grams of whey protein? And they're like, you know, I don't like the taste, or et cetera, et cetera. And then it's like, well, maybe we should take that specific dose of essential amino acids in a crystalline form, make it taste okay, because crystalline amino acids don't always taste great, but and get them to ingest that. And you can do that in a liquid form, for example, in a solution, and, you know, maybe they'll tolerate that. So it's you know, sort of what can you do to get them to be and mount this anabolic response that they normally wouldn't. So if you try to get them to eat 25 grams of protein through food, it might be a tough go. Can you do it with a supplement? No, I don't know. How about, and then it's sort of essential amino acids and on down from there. So it's always what you can practically manage, and then trying to
negotiating. A negotiation.
Yeah.
It's always a negotiation with the patient.
Yeah, it's sort of, you know, will you drink this? And no, I don't like the taste of that. Will you drink? And so the crystalline amino acids often come in an aqueous solution that's, you know, it's sort of like a sport drink. And so some people like, oh, that's not too bad. And so that's a win, I think. And so, yeah, I take that for sure.
Another thing that probably can help, especially for elderly patients, is like if they are very low appetite, sometimes you can find these supplements that are like milkshakes that contain a decent amount of protein and amino acids, and they are like a compact, like 125 mils. Like if you have no appetite, this doesn't require much thinking. Just drink it, and that's it, and that's
the volume
finished.
Is a big one for older patients as well, and for a lot of reasons. I mean, they won't drink. You know, young folks, and you're like, you know, here's 400 mils, and they'll slam it back, no issues. When people get older, I mean, you know, continence issues are become a big deal, right? So they don't want to drink large volumes of fluid and, you know, have to go to the bathroom continuously. They prefer to drink much smaller volumes. So if you can get it into, you know, those 125 mil, almost like a shot format, that's a really great product for sure.
All right, let's move on to the last question regarding your papers. This one was the last one you published, I think, last year on nutritional supplements to support exercise in countering the sarcopenia on aging.
Yeah.
And in this particular paper, which supplements did you find that really support muscle retention, accretion in elderly? For example, which supplements specifically, the dosage, maybe the timing, the frequency, are these factors important utilizing these particular supplements?
Sure. Well, I mean, we've already talked about protein, so absolutely it's on the list. And I think what probably the rest of the list wouldn't surprise too many people. I mean, when we come down, creatine is a very, you know, it's an effective, potent anabolic supplement that you can get, you know, again, can you get older people to take it? It's probably better done for older people in small doses over a longer period of time, rather than the big loading phase and et cetera, which I don't think many older people would enjoy. Omega-3 fatty acids, so long chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, again, higher doses probably required for a longer period of time because they don't just go up and stay up. And I think the big one for older people, and it's probably generic to a lot of patient groups as well, maybe depending on where your latitude is. You know, we don't get a lot of useful sunshine in Canada, only about 3 months a year where I'm located, and that's vitamin D. So long as you can get people from deficient or insufficient vitamin D status up to sufficient, that's really all you need. And it's sort of, you know, check again, what are all these sort of pathways that are probably coming in from different signaling events, but they're culminating in anabolic sensitivity. And all of those 4 supplements I just mentioned would sort of target different processes in the pathway and cover more people. Now, if you can get people to be physically active, then everything works better.
So in that case, if you look at, we have these supplements, are these supplements start becoming a little bit more important just because people start eating less variety? So they're not getting enough fish or enough omega-3 fatty acids. They move less, so they get less to outdoors, so they're not getting enough sun. Is that the reason, or they actually are needed in higher doses that you couldn't physiologically, like with your diet, obtain?
Yeah, well, you know, so it would be wrong of me if I'm sitting here with a dietitian to talk about not a food first approach. I like absolutely hands down, like, you know, if you can eat it and get it in your diet, then do it that way. I think that's always better. I think we're now beginning to understand some of the food matrix effects that, you know, before it was, you know, we took the purified nutrient and it's like, that's all we need. And now we're beginning to understand actually there's probably other, I'll just call it stuff, but, you know, compounds, we have no idea what they're doing. So sort of the matrix of things that are in fruits and vegetables and fish and, you know, this sort of thing. But you can achieve some of the effects by taking the supplements. So yeah, food first if you can do it. I think as you get older and your appetite goes down and your energy expenditure tends to go down, so you tend to eat a little bit less, you're maybe not choosing the right diet, etc., then supplements can be helpful. Do you need, you know, more than you could ever get in a dietary form? Creatine, definitely. There's no way we can, well, that's not true. Some people eat enough meat to get, you know, 3 grams or 4 grams of creatine, but not this guy. and most people would have to consume it in a supplement form. Similarly with vitamin D, food sources, as you know, unless they're enriched or fortified with vitamin D, it's not going to happen. Now, you're in a part of the world where sunshine exposure isn't a rate limiting factor, but still people are told, put your sunscreen on, and that effectively blocks vitamin D synthesis. So, for Canadians, people say, what supplements do you take? And I said, well, definitely from sort of November onwards all the way through May, I take 1,000 IUs of vitamin D a day because there's not enough sunshine here for us to make it. And, I adhere to all the advice and put sunscreen on. I don't want to get a sunburn. So I think all of those are something that you have to think about for sure.
And I know that vitamin, like the sun rays, and specifically in specific seasons, is completely different. Like in summer, you just need like 20 minutes of sun exposure, totally naked in front of the sun, and you're done. But if you're in winter, for example, you need to expose yourself even like the double of the time, at least 45 minutes. And you have to be like exposed completely naked to at least get all in your skin. But obviously people are not doing that, and they're not going to get naked in front of the sun and 25 minutes just to get sun. So that's why I think probably vitamin D seems to be helpful, and especially in people that wouldn't get around very much or very often. And elderly seem to struggle with this, especially because obviously aging or like lack of independence or just mobility issues. So vitamin D seems to be helpful in this case, I guess.
Yeah, a lot of older people spend a lot more time inside. Even when they go outside, they cover themselves up and they wear, long clothing and et cetera, that younger people wouldn't. But I mean, we're all adhering to messages around, limit your exposure to the sun because of skin cancer, et cetera, et cetera. And to your point, you're spot on, Astrid. Like, in the summer, take your shirt off, go outside, 15 minutes, you're good to go. But, in the winter, the way that the Earth's tilted now, the UV rays that come through and create your own vitamin D, well, we don't get enough sunshine here, and we're too far north that vitamin D supplementation makes sense. People who live near the equator, no issues. There's always enough sunshine, no problem.
Now let's move to some of the audience questions we had here. And one of them was, which is better for muscle maintenance during a period of energy deficit? So to retain muscle when you're in a deficit, is it better whey protein powder or eggs?
I don't know which one's better. Those two, I think that they probably equally as effective, to be fair. I grew up in a time where there were protein powders that really only came from one company, and they tasted awful. So an egg was always one of the sources. And so I'm not really high on egg protein powder. I prefer whey, because it tastes awesome, So that would be my go-to answer. But not to say, I don't think those are very high quality proteins, both.
Yeah.
So, the difference between them would be small. My preference would be to go with whey protein, but probably not a lot of difference, to be fair.
And eggs are very, very versatile, very cheap and accessible. So I think it would be a good match. Like you could have either, and they both pretty good.
Yeah. One of the things I laugh a little bit because when we talk to the seniors that come into my exercise center, one of the things we talk about is trying to get enough protein, and they say, well, what sources? And I say eggs, and they're like, oh no, eggs, cholesterol, and I'm like, look here. I said, look here, you're 80. The last thing you need to worry about is cholesterol. I'm like, have an egg. They're cheap, they're available, they're a great source of nutrients that are really tough to get everywhere else, and they're a good source of protein. They're pretty satiating. And I said, don't worry, So they go, oh well, cholesterol, blah blah blah. But you get the story. But yeah, super versatile and very affordable too. So why not?
Actually, I make pancakes for breakfast with eggs and whey protein, both together.
I've seen the recipes, so yeah, no, that's a great mix. This whey protein now is, it used to be that it was always heavily flavored and everything, but you can get whey proteins now absolutely unflavored. You can add them to lots of different recipes. So yeah, I've seen high protein brownies, high protein pancakes, all kinds of things. So, and we said before,
oh yes,
I like the way you put this. You said, if you're going to overeat, in quotation marks, anything, make it protein. And so I won't disagree there.
I agree, completely agree with that. Now, the second question I had here is your stance on utilizing BCAAs for either performance or recovery. Do you think they play any role in muscle gain retention or muscle retention?
So, I'm going to defer to one of my mentors on this, a guy named Bob Wolf, who wrote a really great paper. And he says, branched chain amino acids contain 3 of the 9 essential amino acids. The one that is really important, and I mean head and shoulders important over all of the others, is leucine. So if they work at all, it's because they have leucine in them. But the best that you can do if you provide leucine is slow down, break down for a little bit. You can never become fully anabolic using leucine. It just doesn't work because it's only 1 brick. And so at some point, the people building the wall are looking down and there's only, 1 amino acid. And they're like, oh, we can't fill this hole here. We can't put this brick in the wall. So, it would be better to have all of the essential amino acids. And that's a complete protein. So whey protein is a great example. So that's where branched chains. So, at the very best, they could do, this, and that's sort of stop breakdown. And a lot of guys go, and I was, maybe a lot of women too, but it's more guys. They say, well, when I'm doing intermittent fasting, I want to slow down breakdown. And I'm like, how much do you think you break down in a day? And they're like, well, I don't know. And I'm like, well, it's grams of protein. Like you couldn't measure it on a scale in a million years. So, I'm not sure that, suppressing breakdown in that is really the major concern. If you're intermittent fasting and you're lifting weights, then you're providing the best anabolic stimulus to hang on to muscle protein that you can. Forget about the branch chains. They're a waste of time and money, in my opinion.
So I guess in that particular case, you would be aiming for at least hitting your total daily protein targets, and your resistance training, obviously, keep that as a big priority.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it sort of comes back, in the hierarchy, what's the biggest stimulus? And it's always activity and loading over and above any dietary intervention, unless you're not eating, enough of it. So when you're cutting and trying to, shed a bit of fat mass, then things get a little tighter because now your energy budget, your calorie budget is squeezed. And so the choices become much more important around quality. What other nutrients are you getting? And so then decisions get a little bit more, you got to be judicious about how you make them.
So would you say that the more energy availability you have, probably the less protein you need? So like if you're at maintenance or in a calorie surplus, you probably don't need as much protein because protein is like muscle sparing. Yeah. Like calories and like carbohydrate intake and fat intake, all of these extra macronutrients would help to sort of reduce the protein breakdown somehow because of the energy availability. Yeah. But when you're in a calorie deficit, you don't have that much energy availability. So protein intake would be a little bit more important. So it becomes a little bit more of a priority.
Absolutely. Spot on. I mean, we've known for decades now, well, probably even longer, when you have people in an energy surplus, you retain more nitrogen, you retain more protein. I mean, that's just the way things go. So, when I was talking to especially younger athletes who wanted to gain weight, I would say, well, it's the seafood diet. And they're like, the seafood diet. I'm like, well, you see it, you eat it. So eat a lot, put yourself in an energy surplus, and then weight gain becomes, much easier. Some of it might be fat, and they're like, well, I want to stay lean. And I'm like, well, that's the balance between, not gaining body fat, but gaining enough lean mass. Like, gaining weight is it's pretty easy, right? Got to eat a lot of
But it's tricky.
Yeah.
But it's tricky if you want to gain the right type of weight.
So that's that's where the art and the science of, balancing those things and figuring out very, I think, personal and specific goals relative to your energy expenditure, where you want to be, what you want to do, etc. Putting yourself in an energy deficit, again, it's not rocket science, but once you do that, now the budget of energy that you have becomes much more constrained. And so you've got to make, more judicious choices about the quality of the protein that you eat, probably when you eat it. So post-exercise becomes really important. And what foods you're going to make the choice around to get all of the other nutrients that your body needs, right? So, if you're not getting sufficient, calcium, iron, et cetera, then those are going to become limiting at some point. So, and I'm sure you've seen it. Lots of athletes who are on marginal energy intakes and probably dip down into the negative more, and long distance runners come to mind, that are deficient in a number of nutrients because they eliminate one or another of a food group that they just say, I don't eat that, and all of a sudden it's like, well, I get it, you don't eat meat, that's fine, but you're running like 120 miles a week, and now you're iron deficient, and so. Where's the shock after that? If you don't eat meat, like where are you going to get your iron from? So they say, oh, well, I eat spinach, and I'm like, well, you don't eat enough spinach to make up for that.
You have to be very smart when you have like non-heme iron sources, just because they tend to be more difficult to absorb and less bioavailable. So you have to put things together to make sure you're getting the most out of those sources.
So, and that's my, it's to the point of, like a lot of, is veganism and vegetarianism, like, is it smart? And I'm like, if it's your thing, like, it's a very healthy way to eat. My experience with it personally, and also looking at other people, is the people that do it well, and by doing it well, they do their research on how to eat their foods and how to combine.
And they plan. They plan everything.
Yes. And they're very judicious. And so, like I've said before, you can drink a Diet Coke and get a slice of toast, and you can call yourself vegan. But if you do that 3 meals a day, it doesn't mean you're a good, healthy vegan. So just like with, you could fill yourself up with Twinkies, and that's not great either. So I'm not saying it's, one way or the other, but I think you have to be a bit more judicious when you're talking about foods that you can select, or you're in an energy deficit about what it is that you eat.
Okay, awesome. To what extent do carbohydrates decrease muscle protein breakdown? And we just talked about that one. Yeah. I think it's just reframing a little bit more. Why do actually carbohydrates decrease that muscle protein breakdown?
Yeah, so the predominant role through and why carbohydrates decrease protein breakdown is actually through insulin. And, a lot of people, I think, they've taken a course and they've seen a diagram in a textbook, and it will say insulin stimulates protein synthesis. And usually if you went all the way down and you went to the article from which that diagram was drawn or taken or everything, you'd find that it's actually protein synthesis in a tissue like liver. So let's switch over, not that liver's unimportant, but let's switch over to what we really care about and talk about muscle. And in muscle tissue, you only need a very low amount of insulin to get a full anabolic response. And so we talk about insulin as being more permissive. So in other words, so long as you have, a very low amount, and I'm talking about the amount that you might produce, even if you ingested protein, which is, mildly insulinogenic compared to carbohydrates. But the process that is exquisitely sensitive to insulin is muscle protein breakdown. So what it does is insulin signals and really just shuts off breakdown. So it's in the fed state, we get stimulation of protein synthesis, and we get a suppression of protein breakdown. And that's an insulin-mediated process for a large part. There's probably a role that amino acids play in turning off breakdown as well. But what you have to realize is it's a transient thing. And so breakdown comes back up and synthesis turns off probably about 3 or 4 hours after a meal. Add exercise to that, then you extend the anabolic period. So it's mediated through insulin. That's the predominant reason, in muscle at least. In other tissues, it actually stimulates protein synthesis, but you only need a very low level to have that effect in muscle.
What about research which shows that mycoprotein can build muscle as well as milk protein in older adults?
Yeah, so I'm only familiar, so there's a guy named Ben Wall at the University of Exeter, and he's done most of the work on one source of mycoprotein, which comes from a company called Corn. So mycoprotein it's basically fungal, fermented fungal protein, and you take everything. So they don't clean up in quotes, the source at all. So they take the carbohydrate that comes along with the fungus itself. They take the fiber and they just basically put it into foods. In that situation, I think in young people, when they've compared whey protein, for example, to mycoprotein, they find that they're about equivalent. The hard part is that the mycoprotein has a lot of other nutrients as well. So it's got some carbohydrate in there. It's got a little bit of lipid. It's got some fiber. It's got so there's a lot more energy in the mycoprotein than there would be in the whey protein when they've compared them. So I think when you go head to head with the equivalent amount of protein, you would have to say that whey is still a better source. But if people want to choose mycoprotein-based foods or mycoprotein as a source of protein, again, why not? I mean, I think one of the things, pragmatically speaking, in the next few years, we're going to have to figure out how to feed, 7.5 billion people plus. And the most expensive and hardest macronutrient to make and get in our dietary patterns is protein. So it's going to be tough to get it all from, livestock farming. And so I appreciate, and we could get into the environmental issues, which I won't because I'm not an expert in that area at all. But, plant-based proteins, like it or not, are going to become a much more mainstream choice based on concerns that have less to do with, 20 years ago, it was all speciation, it was all, animal cruelty, animal rights and everything, which is still part of the discussion. But now it's around land use, it's around environmental issues and sustainability and lots of other things that, 20 years ago just didn't seem as pressing. But people, Astrid, your age, and not my age, care a lot about and for good reason as well. So people are making decisions, and plant-based protein is going to become a bigger and a bigger story as time goes along, for sure.
Yeah, there seems to be a new boom in good sources of plant-based proteins, like potato protein, corn protein. There seems to be potentially pretty good in terms of the essential amino acids that they can provide in terms of leucine content.
Yeah, I think that's it's interesting to me to see the evolution of some of these protein sources. And, we did some work on potato protein, and everybody goes, how much protein do potatoes have? And I'm like, well, not much, but we grow, I don't know, 1 million metric tons, and we only eat a fraction of that. So the whole concept then is to let's see what we can get back from the proteins that we might otherwise actually throw away and turn back into some sort of fertilizer or compost that we would put back into the earth. So, isolates of proteins from potatoes, from corn, soy's been around for a long time, but pea, rice, hemp, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not the best taste profiles, I would say right now, but the industry folks and the food science people are working on blends and all kinds of different stuff that will definitely make them more appealing and have a better taste profile than is current. But again, in my lifetime, I've gone from protein powders that you literally had to, hold your nose and drink to stuff that, tastes amazing. And so, if that transfer, food scientists are working on this stuff. So you'll see it. It'll happen. It's
all possible.
It's inevitability. And some people are sort of railing against it. And there's a lot of economic arguments around it that I won't get into, but it makes sense for a lot of reasons, for sure.
Yeah, and nowadays it is probably everything is possible with the technology, with advancements in science. Who knew that things would be at this point so advanced? So it is all possible, I think.
Yeah. Well, the next breakthrough is person-made meat. It's we grow it in a dish, and that's where we get our meat from. So and everybody, that's and everything. I'm like, you'll have a generation of kids that I'm sure will grow up eating a lot more of that, and a lot more plant protein than, definitely me and maybe even you ever would. So I think you're going to see more of that stuff as well.
Yeah. Stu, what are your future projects looking forward?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when we're allowed back in the lab, yeah. So we've been on pause for about a year. Most of our work now is centered around aging and trying to mitigate that decline. The older I get, the more I'm vested in that research. So,
I think we all getting interested in that.
So, and I heard your promo for it. You said we're all aging, and that's it. And I think that, people talk about this disease, that disease, and everything. And aging is not clear. It's not a disease, just a biological process, but it's the one everybody's going to go through it. Right. So, it's the one that, we're going to focus on the most, and trying to combine our knowledge of what we know about exercise and dietary and protein and specific interventions that work in younger people. How can we translate these to older people, and what are the benefits that we can give to that population? I'd love to get into other populations as well. It's much harder to do the clinical work. So people who work with cancer patients or diabetics or anybody like that, power to you. It's a really tough job. But we'll continue to push the stuff on older folks for sure.
I agree. Well, Stu, thank you so much for coming to the show, having a chat with me, talking all things protein again, and aging, and all the research you've done is just admirable, and we appreciate all the things you provide to the industry and the science world. So thank you again for that. And again, I really appreciate you. And I hope you have a great day over there today.
Much, Astrid, for having me on. It's a real pleasure. And, to everybody else out there, wherever, there's people all over the world, which is the great thing about this. Stay safe, stay well. And, when this is all over, we'll hopefully see you in person at conferences and that sort of thing.
Oh, yeah, that would be awesome.
It will be great. One day.
I agree. We will see each other one day.
For sure.
I hope you enjoyed these episodes, and make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the bell button so I can provide you with more information every time I upload a video.